All right, in this video, we'll be looking at signal transduction again and giving a little more detail as to some things that can affect signal transduction. So just to review, the signal transduction pathway involves 3 steps, and I used the telephone in the last lecture in order to kind of explain that. And these are the steps of reception, transduction, and response, whereas reception is actually receiving the signal, transduction is relaying that signal, and then response is a cellular response. And typically that cell response is make a protein. And so signal transduction pathways can influence how a cell responds in its environment. Environments are not static, and so what does that mean? That means that environments are constantly changing, and that as environmental stimuli and changes, cellular response can also change. Organisms will need to regulate those cellular pathways in order to respond to their environment. A great example of this is the epinephrine pathway. This elicits the fight or flight response, which causes you to do several things, one of which is to break down more glucose. So you get yourself in a situation that needs more energy, like well, let's use a deer instead of a person. So you have a deer, and the deer sees a cat, big cat, chasing after it like a cougar or something, and the deer will have this fight or flight response, which will cause it to release more sugar so that it can have more energy. So it will cause its blood vessels to dilate. It will cause it to receive more oxygen. All of these things, which will allow its body to function at a better rate. And this is caused by this epinephrine pathway. Epinephrine is just a signal molecule that's produced in one part of the body and is received in another. And it causes the muscles to act differently, the heart to act differently, the liver to act differently. The liver is where a lot of the glucose is stored, for instance. And so you can see this is a basic signal reception, transduction, and then cellular response is make a protein, do a thing, something along those lines. The ability to respond to environmental changes directly affects an organism's ability to survive. And so these kinds of pathways have evolved over time in order to increase the survival of species. Signal transduction may result in changes in gene expression as well. And this would also then create differences in cell function, because remember, genes code for proteins, and proteins do myriad cell functions. And so the changes in gene expression directly affects the changes in cell function. It can target gene expression and alter the amount or type of a particular protein that is being produced. And so the change in protein amount can change a phenotypic, or can cause a phenotypic change. This could even go to development. Certain times in development, there have to be changes that occur in order to create changes in the developing organism. And so here's a great example of this, something called apoptosis. Apoptosis is programmed cell death. And so you take a developing organism, let's say an organism that has a hand shaped like this, like ourselves, or like several number of mammals. For ourselves, for instance, we don't have webbed hands, and so we don't have much use for them. We have a better use to be able to use our fingers independently to grab things and whatnot. And so the space between our hands is cleared off typically to create, the typical hand that you're used to seeing. But this isn't always the case. When you're in embryonic development, there is skin located between each of those digits. That skin is composed of cells. There's blood vessels and everything there. Well, at a certain time in development, those cells are programmed to die. And so that will happen. That happens as a response of signals that are sent from the surrounding cells. Okay, boys, it's time for you to go ahead and be done. And then they go ahead and be done. If there is a disruption in that signal, that can create, well, that skin just kind of stays there. And so people are born with webbed hands, nothing like this. At least I don't know of that case, but I've seen people that have two toes that are fused together or something along those lines, and that is not uncommon at all. Or you can, translate this to other parts of the body as well. People who have a tongue that is attached too far towards the tip of the tongue, and they have to have that clipped or whatever because it's causing speech issues. And so you get the idea. There's apoptosis forms and shapes the body, and it's also important in tumor suppressing, which we will talk about later. Another example of this creating proteins that can change a phenotype has to do with single celled organisms like bacteria. This idea of quorum sensing, which is a signal mechanism in which bacteria can sense one another. Most of the time that we've been talking about cellular signaling, we've been talking about multicellular organisms, and this can affect also single celled organisms like bacteria. They basically send signals to neighboring bacteria saying, "Hey, there's lots of us here," and or there's not very many of us here. And so bacteria will behave differently based on the amount of bacteria that are present. If there are a lot of bacteria present, they can go into like a mode where they're conjugation, where they're actually exchanging DNA, which increases variation, which is a good thing. It's not a reproductive mode or anything, but it is a way to increase variation. They can form biofilms over substances. This protects and allows them to gather resources. They can create something called bioluminescence. If you think about in the ocean, there's bacteria that will glow, and in other parts, there's bacteria that will glow, and these bacteria create kind of this glow in the dark feature. They don't do it at random times. They typically all do it together. Well, how do they know? They don't have eyes. They can't look around and say, okay, it's time to glow. They send signals to one another, and depending on the population density, they will react accordingly. And so this is an example of how the production of a protein is directly tied to environmental stimuli and the signaling that an organism is receiving.